I want you to imagine a sci-fi scenario that is actually happening right now in real medical labs. Researchers are literally steering these tiny millimeter-scale robots.
Right, microscopic, basically.
Yeah, totally microscopic. They're steering them through actual human veins and organs. And they're using these devices, which are sometimes shape-shifting liquid robots or flexible stents to, deliver life-saving drugs directly to a tumor.
Or they act as biosensors in the absolute hardest-to-reach corners of the human body.
Exactly. Welcome to today's deep dive, by the way. We are taking you on a thrilling shortcut right to the bleeding edge of biomedical engineering. Because while these tiny robots sound amazing, there is a massive problem.
A huge one, yeah.
Once these miniature medical devices actually enter the body, they become practically invisible to doctors.
It really is the great bottleneck of modern biomedical engineering right now. I mean, we have engineered these incredibly capable, minimally invasive physical tools that could drastically reduce patient trauma. But their deployment is completely hamstrung by the fact that we just cannot reliably track them on a screen during the actual procedure.
Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We are looking at a fascinating new research paper titled Synthetic X-ray-Driven Tracking and Control of Miniature Medical Devices.
And the solution they propose for this invisibility problem is honestly wild.
It really is. To teach robotic surgical systems how to see and steer these tiny real-world devices, the researchers decided to, bypass reality entirely.
Yeah, they are literally training robots for real surgeries using massive data sets of totally hallucinated AI-generated ghost bodies.
Ghost bodies. I mean, it's such a radical approach to a physical engineering problem.
It is. But to understand why we even have to resort to hallucinated data, we really have to look at the clinical standard for tracking anything inside the body, which is X-ray fluoroscopy.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. The invisible robot problem. Because we know X-ray fluoroscopy is the standard, right? It gives doctors deep tissue penetration and near real-time imaging.
Exactly. And you absolutely need that high frame rate. If you are navigating a moving, living environment inside a patient, you need a live video feed, basically.
Right, but X-rays aren't normal cameras. They don't just capture light bouncing off a surface. They rely on differential attenuation,
Which fundamentally relies on mass and density. And because these miniature medical devices, or MMDs, are microscopic by design, they simply do not have the mass to significantly block or absorb X-ray energy.
so you don't get this nice, crisp silhouette on the surgical monitor.
No, not at all. You get a highly noisy, incredibly low-contrast smudge.
Just a smudge. And that is before you even account for the dynamic anatomy of a living, breathing patient.
Right. The internal environment is totally chaotic. Your low-contrast smudge is constantly being visually occluded by highly dense tissues.
Like rib bone.
Exactly, ribs, or even worse, by metallic surgical tools that are already in the area. Those dense objects completely blow out the contrast curve on the imaging software.
Making the subtle signature of the MMD just vanish entirely. So, I mean, if you're a doctor staring at that monitor, manually tracking this thing while trying to steer it,
It's exhausting.
it's not like looking for a needle in a haystack. I mean, a haystack is stationary. This is more like trying to spot a specific, slightly darker gray pebble tumbling inside a running washing machine that's completely packed with wet gray clothes.
That is a perfect analogy.
Everything is churning, the contrast is essentially zero, and your target just keeps stucking behind the fabric.
That captures the cognitive load perfectly.
Yeah.
I mean, clinicians are staring at these screens for extended periods. They're trying to mentally separate the MMD's faint signature from overlapping anatomical textures.
All while making micro adjustments with remote manipulation tools.
Exactly. It is incredibly stressful, and the resulting operator cognitive fatigue is severe. And when you are operating in a dynamic vascular environment, fatigue actively degrades your surgical precision.
Which is terrifying.
It is. Losing sight of the device for even a fraction of a second could severely compromise patient safety. The device could damage delicate tissue, or you could simply lose it in the bloodstream.
So if human eyes and human brains just max out staring at that gray washing machine, the obvious pivot is computer vision.
Right.
I mean, we have state-of-the-art algorithms today. Why not just hand the video feed over to artificial intelligence and let it track the smudge?
Deep learning is definitely the logical evolution here. Convolutional neural networks excel at picking signal out of noise.
But deep learning has a well-known bottleneck, right? It requires massive, high-quality annotated data sets to learn the statistical distribution of whatever it's supposed to be tracking.
Huge data sets. The AI needs to see tens of thousands of examples of an MMD inside a human body before it can reliably find one on its own.
Which is a huge hurdle, because gathering real X-ray data of these microrobots inside actual human tissues isn't just difficult, it's a logistical nightmare.
You're dealing with specialized imaging equipment, highly restrictive patient privacy regulations, and frankly, prohibitive data collection costs.
But wait, let me push back on this for a second, because this is something you, the listener, might be wondering.
Right.
I can take my phone right now, snap a photo of a completely cluttered, messy workbench, upload it to a vision language model or meta segment anything model, and it instantly puts a bounding box around a specific silver screw.
Sure.
We have massive, zero-shot, general-purpose vision models today. So why are we acting like finding a robot is impossible? Why can't those models just spot these devices out of the box?
This raises an important question, but it comes down to a fundamental difference in the underlying data distributions.
How so?
Those general-purpose models, as powerful as they are trained on natural images. Natural images have distinct edge gradients, shadows, color channels, lighting cues.
Oh, right. X-ray fluoroscopy has literally none of that.
Exactly. It is a purely grayscale density topography. So a model trained on billions of normal photos looks at a fluoroscopy feed and is essentially blind.
The pixel distribution is just completely alien to its training.
Totally alien. And even if you attempt self-supervised learning, where you let the AI try to find the structural patterns on its own without human labels, you still need a massive volume of high-quality, domain-specific source images.
Which simply do not exist for MMDs.
They don't. And even if you miraculously gathered the raw data, you still have the annotation problem. Raw video doesn't train an AI.
Right. You have to tell the AI exactly where the robot is in every single frame of that video.
Which throws us right back to human fatigue. Manual annotation requires a domain expert sitting at a monitor, going frame by frame through a 30 frames per second fluoroscopy video.
Wow.
And they have to manually draw bounding boxes around those barely visible smudges. It is soul-crushing work.
And because the target is so incredibly faint, human annotators inevitably make errors. They get tired.
Exactly. And when you feed inconsistent, error-prone labels into a neural network, the resulting AI performance collapses. It just fails.
So we hit a complete wall. No vast data sets means no computer vision. No computer vision means tired doctors and risky surgeries.
Right up until this paper.
Right. Because the researchers realized that if the data pipeline is completely bottlenecked by reality, well, they should just manufacture a new reality.
Yes. They built an end-to-end framework called MicroSyn-X to synthesize the data completely from scratch.
And generating synthetic medical data is incredibly complex, isn't it?
Yeah.
You cannot just use a basic image generator to slap a picture of a robot over a picture of a rib cage.
No, absolutely not. If you do that, the AI network will instantly overfit to the artifacts of the fake image and fail completely in the real world. The synthetic data has to be physically and anatomically accurate.
So how does MicroSyn-X actually build a fake X-ray that looks real to an AI?
It's a deeply clever multi-stage process. The first step is tissue generation. They utilize a pix-to-pix stable diffusion model. Now, diffusion models generally map random noise into structured images based on text prompts. But here, the researchers tightly constrain that latent space. They don't just ask the AI for a generic chest X-ray.
Right, they input highly specific spatial masks, basically scaffolding, right?
Yes, scaffolding. Outlining the exact geometry of where the soft tissue should sit, the precise architecture of the bone structures, and the specific pathways of the contrast-filled blood vessels.
So spatial mask dictates the structure, and the diffusion model just generates the complex anatomical textures to fill it in.
Exactly. And it is structurally highly convincing. When they benchmarked the generated tissues against real clinical images, they achieved a structural similarity index, or SSIM, between 0.65 and 0.91.
For you listening, what does an SSIM up to 0.91 actually signify in clinical terms?
It signifies that the synthetic tissue captures the exact chaotic frequency of background noise and overlapping anatomical structures that a computer vision model is going to encounter in a real patient.
It gives the AI the correct distractions to learn from.
Precisely. It learns what to ignore.
Okay, so the diffusion model hallucinates this perfectly accurate, highly textured rib cage and vascular system. But the next physical hurdle is getting the microrobot into that image without it looking like a bad Photoshop job.
Right.
Because again, X-rays are density maps.
Yeah.
How did they solve the physics of integrating the robot into the fake tissue?
They implemented what they call an add-weighted strategy. In real X-ray physics, when an object sits inside a body, its density doesn't just replace the tissue behind it.
It modulates the X-ray signals passing through both of them.
Exactly. It creates overlapping attenuation in a 2D projection.
It literally stacks the densities.
Mathematically, yes. MicroSyn-X takes the pixel density values of the synthetic background and calculates the specific localized attenuation of the MMD, and then adds them together.
So it simulates exactly how that device would absorb X-ray photons if it were physically inside that generating tissue.
Yes, exactly.
And simulating the devices themselves is wild,
Yeah.
because they aren't just dropping in rigid, static metal shapes.
Yeah.
Some of these MMDs are stent-structured soft robots.
Right, which are flexible mesh tubes.
Yeah, but they also simulate shape-morphing ferrofluid liquid robots.
The fluid dynamics required to simulate that are just fascinating because these liquid MMDs navigate by squeezing through incredibly narrow, tortuous vascular networks.
So their physical geometry is constantly deforming. You can't just use a static 3D model.
No, you have to generate them dynamically. The framework uses parametric spline curves, which are mathematically defined continuous curves, to generate an infinite variety of organic liquid droplet shapes.
Wow.
And these mathematically mimic how ferrofluid physically deforms under a magnetic field. Then it subjects those shapes to the add-weighted density simulation we just talked about.
They're using mathematical curves to simulate liquid metal deforming inside an AI-generated liver. The layers of simulation here are staggering.
They really are. But what's fascinating here is the downstream benefit of this entire MicroSyn-X architecture.
By auto-labeling.
Yes. Because the computer algorithm is the one doing the math to place the digital MMD into the digital tissue, the system inherently already knows the exact coordinates of every single pixel that makes up that robot.
It solves the annotation nightmare completely.
Zero human input required. Every time MicroSyn-X hallucinates an image, it simultaneously outputs a perfectly precise bounding box and a pixel-accurate segmentation mask for the device.
So you completely eliminate human cognitive fatigue, you eliminate human error, and you can generate 100,000 flawlessly annotated training images over a weekend.
It is basically the holy grail of deep learning. You have infinite, perfect data.
But I am looking at the sim-to-real gap here. Because if you train a neural network exclusively in this pristine, perfectly calculated, math-generated environment, won't reality just completely break it?
That is the big concern, yeah.
I mean, real operating rooms have terrible lighting, aging imaging sensors, random electronic interference. If the AI expects perfect synthetic physics, it's going to fail on a live patient, isn't it?
Bridging that sim-to-real gap is the hardest part of synthetic data training, and the researchers addressed it by intentionally sabotaging their own perfect data.
Sabotaging it.
Yes, using a technique called domain randomization.
Okay, so they introduce chaos into the training set.
Extreme chaos. They take those beautiful, mathematically perfect synthetic X-rays and they aggressively mutate them.
Like how?
They wildly swing the tissue brightness curves. They randomly flip and distort the device positions, and they inject heavy layers of artificial digital noise.
Specifically Poisson, Gaussian, and pepper noise, right? Why those specific types of noise?
Because they perfectly mimic the specific hardware flaws of real-world medical equipment. Poisson noise mimics the photon starvation you get in low-radiation clinical settings.
Oh, that makes sense.
And Gaussian noise mimics the thermal heat generated by the sensor electronics themselves.
They even simulate occlusion, don't they? I read they deliberately generate digital metallic surgical clamps and scatter them across the image.
Yes, intentionally hiding the MMD so the AI only gets to see a tiny fragmented fraction of the robot. It forces the AI to fight for every single pixel.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Domain randomization is basically extreme sports training for the algorithm.
That's a great way to put it.
It makes me think of training a pro tennis player. But instead of feeding them normal tennis balls during practice, the machine is shooting golf balls, water balloons, and bowling balls at totally unpredictable speeds.
Right, it's brutal.
But if the player can somehow learn to hit that absolute chaos, then when they step onto a court for a normal match, the game feels like it's moving in slow motion.
Exactly. The chaos forces the neural network to stop paying attention to the background entirely. If the tissue contrast is constantly changing and the noise profile is constantly shifting, the AI learns that those variables are useless.
Useless for predicting the target.
Yes. It is forced to focus exclusively on the invariant features, the underlying mathematical contour, and the core physical signature of the device itself.
Because that becomes the only reliable way it can minimize its error rate during training.
Precisely.
And to make sure the AI doesn't miss those tiny invariant features, the paper utilizes a patch-based strategy for the training process. Why not just feed the whole X-ray image into the model at once?
It's a tension between global context and local feature extraction. Medical X-ray files are massive grids of high-resolution pixels. If you try to push that entire global image through a complex neural network,
You just exhaust the memory limits of your GPUs. The hardware crashes.
exactly. And even if it didn't crash, the MMD is so microscopically small relative to the entire chest cavity that its crucial pixel data gets mathematically diluted in the sheer scale of the global image.
So they subdivide the massive, cluttered images into smaller, highly localized grid patches.
Right. It allows the neural network to scrutinize the fine-grained local details without being overwhelmed by the irrelevant global context of the entire ribcage.
It optimizes the computational load while preserving the high-resolution features of the microrobot. Okay, so let's look at the culmination of all this. We've built the MicroSyn-X generator. We've hallucinated the anatomical structures.
Yep.
We've mathematically deformed the liquid robots. We've auto-labeled the pixels, intentionally corrupted the data with sensor noise, and trained our neural network on the patches.
A massive undertaking.
So the ultimate question, when they finally take this AI, hook it up to a real surgical robot, and point it at a real live body, does it actually work?
The real-world deployment is where this methodology truly proves its worth. They integrated their trained computer vision model, specifically utilizing YOA 11 seg.
Which is an architecture highly optimized for real-time object segmentation, right?
Right. They integrated it into an actual teleoperated robotic system.
A physical robotic arm equipped with actuating magnets.
Yes, the arm generates dynamic magnetic fields to physically pull and steer the magnetic MMDs through the tissue. They tested the entire closed-loop system in real time using real X-ray fluoroscopy.
On real
Yes, on ex vivo animal tissues and, crucially, dynamic live in vivo environments. Live, breathing subjects with active blood flow.
And the AI could see the robots.
It successfully localized and guided both the flexible magnetic soft robots and the shape-shifting liquid metal robots in real time. It maintained a lock on the devices despite the respiratory motion and the overlapping anatomy.
That is incredible.
It is. But the most significant finding of the entire study is the comparative performance.
The twist.
The twist, yes. The model trained strictly on the hallucinated synthetic data actually outperformed baseline models that were trained on painstakingly gathered, human-annotated real-world data.
Stop. The AI that learned everything it knows from a mathematically faked matrix was better at real surgery than the AI that learned from real surgeries.
Quantifiably better. They measured the accuracy using MAP50 and MAP50.95 metrics.
Which evaluate how perfectly the AI's predicted boundaries overlap with the true physical boundaries of the device.
Exactly. The synthetic trained model scored higher across the board, and its superiority was most pronounced in the absolute worst conditions.
The messy environment.
Yes, low contrast, highly noisy, highly occluded dynamic environments. Where the real-world AI lost track of the robot, the synthetic AI maintained its lock perfectly.
How does that even happen? How does fake data prepare you for reality better than reality itself?
The researchers proved why using feature extraction analysis. They pushed the datasets through a model called Inception v3 and then used principal component analysis, or PCA.
Which, for you listening, takes thousands of complex visual variables and squashes them down into a 2D scatter plot so we can physically see the footprint of what the AI knows.
Right. When they mapped that footprint, the real-world dataset formed a tiny, tight cluster in the center of the graph.
Because real data is inherently limited by whatever the doctors happen to encounter on the specific days they record it.
Exactly. It only represents a very narrow band of normal surgical conditions.
But the synthetic data,
because of the domain randomization, the intentional chaos we discussed, the synthetic data covered a massive sprawling footprint on that map.
it exposed the model to extreme edge cases.
Weird occlusions, heavy static scenarios a surgeon might only see once in 1,000 procedures. So when the live surgery got messy and unpredictable, the AI trained on real data failed.
because it had never seen that specific anomaly before.
Right, but the synthetic trained AI just navigated right through it because it had already solved a simulated version of that exact mess a million times.
It fundamentally proves that data scarcity doesn't have to be a roadblock in medical science if you can mathematically simulate reality with enough variance.
And to make sure this accelerates the entire field, the researchers open sourced their data sets. They released D1, which is dynamic real-world data for testing.
And D2, the static real data.
And finally, D3, the massive synthetic dataset generated by MicroSyn-X. Anyone globally can now use this to benchmark new tracking algorithms.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the implications for the clinical landscape are profound. We are looking at the threshold of fully automated, precision-guided microsurgery.
Exactly. By solving the visual tracking bottleneck, we transition minimally invasive procedures from a high-stress manual chore into a reliable, closed-loop system.
The clinician is no longer fighting the equipment to find the tool, they are simply directing the clinical outcome. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Solving a highly abstract math problem regarding pixel density in a computer lab doesn't just build a smarter algorithm.
No, it has real physical impact.
It directly paves the way for a future where a microscopic, shape-shifting robot can navigate your bloodstream to deliver a life-saving drug precisely to a tumor without a surgeon ever making a single physical incision. It reduces the trauma on your body and radically accelerates your recovery.
It is a massive leap forward.
We started this deep dive looking at the limitations of X-raying tiny robots and the immense, exhausting bottleneck of human annotation. We explored how MicroSyn-X mathematically fakes the literal physics of an X-ray to generate perfect data.
Then injects artificial chaos to harden the neural network against reality.
And ultimately deploys a superior digital guide for live surgical robots.
No.
But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Oh, this should be good.
If an AI model can safely and reliably navigate a physical robot inside a real, beating human organ solely because it trained on thousands of hallucinated synthetic bodies that never actually existed, what does that mean for the future of medical experience? For thousands of years, a surgeon's skill was defined by the real lives they touched, the real anatomies they saw, and the real complications they overcame.
True.
But moving forward, are the most experienced, infallible digital surgeons of our future going to be the ones who earn their precision entirely by operating on ghosts? Something to think about?